Sorry, I kind of got cut off in the last video, but we're about to finish up this lecture, so it won't be too much longer. But I was talking about Sam Adams. So Sam Adams led a protest in Massachusetts against specifically the Stamp Act, but basically Grenville's program in general. But he, Sam Adams, and his second cousin, John Adams, whose name might sound familiar to you because he's a future president of the United States, protested in Massachusetts against what the British were doing. And they declared that no man can justly take the property of another without his consent. And they also said that the people have the right of representation in the same body, which exercises the power of making laws for levying taxes. So basically, remember with the Sugar Act, the cry was no representation, no taxation without representation. So in other words, what's upsetting the colonists so much is they feel like they're not being represented in Parliament, and Parliament is making all these decisions about taxing them. And so they're saying it's not fair. But we also want to note this fellow right here, his name is Patrick Henry, who we mentioned just a bit ago. He is also one who hates the Stamp Act. In fact, the colonists most hated the Stamp Act. And lots of them wrote pamphlets about just how terrible it was. But anyway, Patrick Henry is a somewhat fiery kind of fellow, and he's famous for addressing the Virginia legislature. And he says to the Virginia legislature, which remember is the House of Burgesses, that he says, Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III may profit from their example. In other words, he's saying that Brutus and Charles both had somebody in their lives, to keep them in check, and keep their power in check, ultimately by the decease of Caesar and Charles I. And when he's saying George III may profit from their example, he's saying that George III's power needs to be checked. And then, of course, people responded to that statement, which was rather bold, by saying that it was treason. And Henry responds with, if this be treason, make the most of it. And the House is carried over by his passion, and they adopt a resolution that it alone, the House of Burgesses, had the right and power to lay taxes upon the inhabitants of the colony. So remember, the colonists are upset because they feel like that Britain is overstepping its bounds. So what Sam Adams and others do is they organize a society known as the Sons of Liberty. And this is specifically in Boston. They organize this society. And basically the society is designed to hold parades, hold protests. They destroyed the hated stamps. And they forced stamp distributors to resign. And this example of the Sons of Liberty was followed in other colonies. And one of the most powerful things that the colonists did was they decided to boycott. And boycott's when you refuse to buy something. So they decide they're going to not buy British goods until the Stamp Act is repealed. And the boycott, of course, is going to hurt the British merchants. And the British merchants in turn are going to pressure Parliament. And in 1765, a group of 9 colonies gather together and they have the Stamp Act Congress. And basically in this Congress, they adopt a resolution to oppose the tyrannical acts of the British Parliament. So you can see that there's a lot of tension going up. They're calling their king a tyrant. They're very unhappy. So what about in England? What's going on in England? Well, Parliament starts to debate whether or not they should repeal the Stamp Act, because Parliament felt like they were representing the colonists, and even though the colonists said that it wasn't so, Parliament felt like they were virtually representing them. So the idea is that even though there are no colonists represented in Parliament, there was the concept of them being represented through the people who were there. But the colonists did not like this idea of virtual representation. They wanted somebody who was physically from the colonists, who knew the colonists' interests, who was for the colonists to represent them. And not all members of Parliament agreed with what was going on in the British government. And one of them was Edmund Burke, who I have pictured here. And he actually was on the side of the colonists. He argued that the colonies had become powerful political entities, and that whether Parliament liked it or not, they must be dealt with on the principle of freedom, for the colonists would refuse to be treated in any other way. However, finally, in 1776, Parliament repeals the Stamp Act, but on the exact same day that it repeals it, it adopts the Declaratory Act, which declares that the colonies are subordinate to England and Parliament, and that Parliament had the power to pass laws to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So the colonists got what they wanted, but at the same time, England still drawing her authority over the colonies by declaring that she has the power to tax. The colonists rejoice that the Stamp Act is repealed, and they choose to ignore the fact that the Declaratory Act was enacted. So it seems like things are going to be peaceful for a while, but actually trouble is far from over for the American colonists and for England. Thank you. Bye.